For our final lecture of our Early American Settlement unit, we're going to take a look at the role of religion in society, not only how it kind of served as a backbone of society, but how different movements are going to shape the direction of society. Now, we've already kind of seen how religious changes influenced colonization and, the setup of these different places. But to colonial Americans, religion was highly influential, and taxes or dues were often paid to a local church. Even though he was not a fan of organized religion by any means, Ben Franklin paid his dues to his local Presbyterian minister because he recognized its function within society. Now, specific religions were dominant in different regions. We've seen that the Puritans were dominant in Plymouth, in Massachusetts, and Connecticut, the Anglicans in Virginia, and you can go on down the line here. But churches served as not only centers of information and as places for social gatherings, but they upheld social hierarchies by assigning pews, meaning where you sat was based on how much aid you gave to the church, and positions of power within the church also went to the wealthiest members of society. Now, at this time, we're into the 1700s by this point, there was tension between what were called evangelicals and rationalists. Evangelicals really disliked the formal ceremonies of worship, and in their mind, full membership in churches had been dwindling because religion was losing its former intensity. So they're all about the spontaneity of, the faith. They're about the individual experience of communicating with God. Whereas rationalists are beginning to believe in this thing called the scientific method. And they believe that God did create the universe, but didn't interfere with its laws. Things like lightning and thunder had natural explanations as opposed to, divine anger. Now, evangelicals are going to begin to become more influential when a series of what are called revivals break out in the colonial North. Now, these revivals had periodically occurred over the past 6 decades, beginning in the 1680s. But the 1730s and 1740s produced something different. The idea behind these revivals was that salvation could not be earned through good deeds and good behavior, but one simply had to submit to God fully and express their hopelessness. These revivals would feature sermons that truly were designed to shock listeners, and they would attempt to allow listeners to experience an ecstatic experience. So, you have traveling preachers going from town to town. Pretty much the whole town comes out to see them, but it's all about that individual emotional union with God. And this movement is something different in that it does become known as the Great Awakening. This so-called Great Awakening is the process by which revivals move from being local to more intercolonial because ministers begin to collaborate with one another. And most of the previous revivals had actually centered around the conversion of females, but this time just as many men began to undergo conversion. Now, there's 2 names that stand out. The first is the man on screen, Jonathan Edwards. Edwards of Massachusetts is really the first great preacher of the Great Awakening. He published an account of God acting through the colonies, and his account was read throughout the colonies and Great Britain. In his most famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, he emphasized that the only thing to save the soul of each human was the inexplicable grace of God. I mean, this man really, truly put the fear of God into listeners, which is ironic because many sources indicate that his sermons were delivered monotone. He wrote them out, he would kind of stare at the back of his audience, but he would speak in a very monotone voice. But it was simply the message and what he said that shocked his listeners. So we have someone in the American colonies, and we have a Brit, George Whitefield. And Whitefield was a young Anglican minister who was familiar with the work of Edwards, and he toured England and Wales, and sought out poor and marginalized groups who were ignored by the Anglican Church. This is characteristic of the Great Awakening. The emphasis on the emotional conversion of the poor, the young, and common people who were either ignored or marginalized within their communities. Now, Whitefield often preached in streets and parks because his crowds were simply too big for traditional churches. And when he toured the colonies for 1 year, he made several trips across the Atlantic. But one time he went and he stayed in Philadelphia for a week and even earned the respect of the skeptical Ben Franklin. Franklin agreed to be the sole publisher and distributor of his works, although this might have been more for monetary gain than anything else. So why does it matter? Why does this religious movement gain so much focus and attention? Well, this is about the individual. The individual experience of conversion. And American individualism is a very unique idea. This concept of the self. And this movement also challenged traditional authority. In this case, perhaps traditional religious authorities. So this movement of challenging traditional religious authorities is going to transfer over to challenging other systems of politics, systems of governments, which does lead indirectly to the American Revolution.